Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope I'm in view in the video. I'm slightly scatterheaded today. This is during the admissions period. As you can hear, I have lost my voice. Just started coming back today. At least I've got a microphone, that helps. I'm going to take it back and use it for interviews tomorrow if I can. Basically, if you can't hear my voice, don't panic too much. If you can't hear Daisy's when she starts speaking, that might be a different matter. But we have done an audio test. We've got thumbs up from people who were online at the very beginning, so hopefully all will be okay. Delighted tonight to welcome some new people to the room. Just so you know how this works, basically we do a short talk, 20, 25 minutes at most, it could be less, it's up to Daisy. And then we take a short break so that people in the room and at home can go and get more snacks and drinks, which is obviously important, which will enjoy themselves in doing science. And then we start a discussion. If you're online, if you could put your questions and comments in the chat and I will read them out, or I might get other people to read them out, given that my voice isn't great. And if you're in the room, I will just bring you the microphone. We do it this way so that there's reliable audio for everybody, whatever their hearing loss. So if you wouldn't mind using the mic when you're in the room, that makes a very big difference to other people. The point of the cafe is that science is for everybody, and scientists ought to be good enough to be able to explain their science, whatever the background of the people listening. That's exactly what we generally find works really, really well, this cafe. The Oxford Café is one of the oldest. It was the fourth to be set up. The originator was a guy in Leeds, and then after that, Nottingham and Newcastle started. They were my friends of his. And then one of my co-workers, when I was a postdoc researcher, went and did his party piece on antibiotic resistance in Leeds and came back down on the train the next day going, we've got to start one. Oxford can't be that one. So we began it, and then various people from the Wellcome Trust and other organisations came to ours and went, this is a good idea. Let's put some money into making sure they can start all over the country. So we feel half responsible. I think this is now, we're into the 27th year we've been doing this. Just about, I think, 26 or 27. If you came at this from a different route, there is a website online, Oxford Café Scientifique. There's also a mailing list, and people can join us if they want to. If you're online, you've probably managed to already join the mailing list, because you've probably got an email about it. The website's always at the bottom, and at the bottom of the front page of the website is how to join. I'll talk a bit more about the cafes coming up in the spring at the end of today. A little bit of housekeeping for those in the room. If the fire alarm goes off, which we hope it won't, because I hope most of this department is too lazy to do work right now, then we get out quick. Don't pick anything up. There are some stairs at the back, which is a very quick way all the way down. Don't try to use the lift. The main stairs are also fine. Get out to the front of the building, so the way you came in, away from the building, i.e. at the bottom of the bike rack area, and we'll do a quick head count and make sure you've got everybody before the firemen panic about it. But it hasn't happened yet, so touch wood. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to our speaker. So Daisy Abraham started her research life in New Zealand, where she did her degree, and then she decided to come to Oxford. She's a behavioural ecologist, so working on animal and bird behaviour, and she's lucky enough to be in the very nice building just over to our right, which has been built over the last summer. I'm going to hand over to her, but don't forget, you can ask questions in the main discussion. So interrupt if anything's not clear in the room, but remember you'll have another chance later. Over to you, Daisy.
Thanks, Rachel. Is that working? Yeah. Right. Hi, I'm Daisy. That's what the D stands for. Don't worry about the A. That's unless that's a question for at the end. So I'm a PhD student. I'm in the last year of my DPhil here in Oxford, and today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about specifically the first two chapters of my thesis, just because those are the two that are done. But I work on social behaviour generally, and specifically social behaviour in these guys, in great tits. And my sort of first two chapters are looking at social responses to partner loss. So I'm interested in social behaviour very broadly. And when we look at social behaviour in animals, one of the ways that we really commonly kind of summarise it is through these things called...
Try the arrow. Okay.
Uh-oh.
Definitely should be working.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Right, try it again.
Through these things called
social
networks. So you might have seen social networks in a human context. Obviously, the phrase is often used to refer to things like Facebook. They were also a pretty common point of discussion in the COVID pandemic, kind of used to model how COVID might spread throughout populations. But we also use them in animal context to study animal behavior. So when you have a social network, these here we call them nodes, and they represent individuals, and the lines between the individuals represent connections. So using that quite simple model of how individuals interact, you can get into some really, really interesting analyses of animal social behavior. But often, kind of traditionally, when we've used social networks, they're presented as quite static. So they're often studied as if you kind of take this snapshot of a group of animals, you look at how they interact together, and that doesn't change. But in reality, social networks, and we know this from our own lives, our kind of social lives are very dynamic. They change a lot. We sort of adjust who we interact with. It's a very constantly shifting thing. And I think that it's really important to think of animal social networks in the same way, and particularly to think of individual animals as kind of agents in their own social life. So animals aren't just going to sit there and let whatever happens. They have an interest in maintaining a particular social life, and they're going to act to maintain that even as their life sort of changes around them. And so my work is kind of looking at this specific example of the great tits and trying to look at how individuals might adjust their own social behavior in response to changes in the world around them. So the reason that great tits in particular are quite a good study species for this question is that they have quite a sort of dynamic, shifting social structure. So in the winter, they form what we call fission-fusion flocks. So humans are fission-fusion as well. All that means is that they'll be in a group, but that group will sort of shift. So they might be in a group for an hour, they're all traveling around feeding together, then they'll break apart, they'll go join another group, and there's this constant, quite dynamic movement in their association. So they're going to be associating with a lot of different individuals throughout the day. But as winter kind of turns into spring, they start to shift their social behavior a little bit. So they begin to prioritize a specific relationship, which is their relationship with their breeding partner. So that bond gets stronger as the winter goes on, and then by the time you get to the spring, they're what we call socially monogamous. So that means that they spend their time with their breeding partner, they build a nest together, they raise the chicks together, they feed them, they get the chicks through the fledging together. They're not genetically monogamous. They do go off and breed with individuals from other pairs, but we're focusing on the social behavior today, so they're socially monogamous. That's the important thing. And this is a really interesting kind of, like I said, way to study the ways in which individuals are changing their social behavior. And particularly, I was interested in that transition. So how these birds are managing the transition between this winter social behavior and the spring social behavior, where they look pretty different. And the data set that I used to study that is from Whiting Woods. So it's near Oxford, some of you may have been. It's a very, very nice place. I get to spend a lot of my life there now, which is lovely. And in Whiting, one of their kind of claims to fame is that the Great Tit study there is the longest running individual-based ecological study in the world, which is quite a long sentence, but I promise it's actually quite an exciting thing. So for, have I cut out? No, we're all good. For many decades now, they've been studying the breeding behavior of the birds in the woods. So all these little dots here represent nest boxes that have been put up in the woods, and great tits really like to breed in nest boxes. Naturally, they breed in holes in trees, but the nest boxes are nice and dry, and they're not going to sort of fall over randomly, and they're a bit harder for predators to get into. So great tits actually prefer to breed in our nest boxes, which is great for us. We've put loads of them up in the woods, and that means that we can track which individuals are breeding together, so we can keep track of the pairs, when they lay their eggs, how many eggs they've laid, when they hatch, how many chicks fledge, loads of different kind of demographic questions like that. So that sort of covers the spring aspect of their social behavior. And then there's this other data set I use, which is from 2011 to 2015, and that is of supplementary feeders that were put up through the woods. So these big dots here represent feeders, and the birds can go to those feeders and get a little something to eat, and they do that in those feeding flocks, so in those groups. And the birds have radio tags on them. And what that means is that when they go to the feeder, it registers what individual has come to the feeder. And by doing that, we can keep a track of which individuals are turning up at the feeder together, and therefore we're saying have associated together. And there is a little video of how that works, so you can kind of see it in action. If it will play. Maybe not. Okay, we might have to skip the video.
I'll see if I can work it out in the break. And
yeah, we can have a look. You'll have to trust me. But basically what happens is birds come to the feeder, and when they come to the feeder, it registers which individual is there, and we can build up one of those social networks from that. So what I was interested in is, okay, we have this data about what they're doing in the spring. We have this data about what they're doing in the winter, but we haven't done that much to combine the two. So I was interested in how the birds were taking information about what happened in the spring and carrying it over to their social behavior in the winter. And in order to do that, first of all, I had to sort of classify what was going on with the spring. So, there we go. What I'll be using throughout the talk is these kind of definitions of types of pairs. So the first one is faithful pairs. They breed together, then we have this winter in the middle, and then we see them breeding together again in the next spring. Then we have divorced pairs. They're breeding together, winter in the middle, and then we see them off breeding with other individuals in the next spring. New pairs, they don't know each other. There's the winter, then they breed together, and then juvenile pairs, which were born in the previous spring and then seen breeding together in the next. There are some things that can happen to great tits that are not covered by these classifications. So, for example, if one of them dies, but we will come back to that later. So for now, just stick with these 4 types of pairs. And I wanted to know what's happening in that middle winter. So we know what's going on here and we know what's going on here, but how is what they're up to in the middle affected by their behavior in the spring? Basically, if they don't have a very good breeding season, they're more likely to get divorced. So if pairs that eventually go on to get divorced are behaving differently in the winter, what that's implying is that they're carrying information from the spring context over into the winter context and using that to adjust their social behavior, which would be pretty cool. So we'll jump right into some results. I will build up this graph for you a little bit. So on the x-axis here, we have the experimental day. So that is just across the winter. Starts in about November and it ends in about February, depending on the year. This is kind of data from across a few years combined. On the y-axis there is simple ratio index, which is a measure of how often the birds are seen associating together. So if that's a 0, that means they were never seen together at all. If it's a 1, that means that every time we saw that bird there too. They were never seen separately. The thick lines are the sort of averages for this type of pair. So here we have the faithful pairs. What you can see is that they start out relatively high and it increases as the winter goes on. And that is what we'd expect. Like I said, they're sort of using this winter partially to strengthen that pair bonding relationship before they go into the socially monogamous phase in the spring. And then if we add on the new and the juvenile pairs, they start out significantly lower than the faithful birds, which makes sense. Again, they don't know each other, unlike the faithful pairs, which already have an existing relationship. But by the end of the spring, they're pretty much up to being as close to each other as the faithful birds are. So then if we look at the divorced birds, what we see is that, there they are, they start low and they stay low. So from the beginning of our kind of experimental data collection period, they are basically acting like a pair of birds that don't know each other at all. So they're spending about as much time together as a new pair is at the start of the winter, where there's no pre-existing relationship, and then there's no sort of strengthening of that bond over the winter. So when we anthropomorphize, this makes a lot of sense, right? You're like, yeah, if I'd got a divorce, I wouldn't be hanging out with them much. But it is still pretty interesting to see that there is this process going on in these birds. They don't have the largest brains in the world, so it's quite exciting to see that they're able to kind of do these actually quite complicated social processes of adjusting how they're interacting with specific individuals based on what's going on at other points in their life. So from this information, we know that they can adjust their social behavior in response to changes in their social context. And what we were curious about was whether this plasticity, this ability to respond to their environment, could help them respond to social disturbance more generally. So other kind of things that might happen in their life. And we thought, okay, what is a bigger social disturbance than getting a divorce? Is being widowed. This also was a bit cheeky of me. When I was doing the divorce analysis, a whole load of data I couldn't use because one of the birds in the pair had died, and I was just like, oh, I want to use that really bad. That's loads of good data. And then I finally got my hands on it to do this analysis, and after doing all of my filtering, I actually had less in the end than I'd had with the divorce pairs. So it was all a bit disappointing, but we were quite interested in what would happen when the birds were widowed, if they would show any sort of social behavioural response to the death of their partner. You'd expect that they would, because they've invested a lot in this relationship, and they do need a partner for the spring. So we sort of hypothesized that after their partner died, they might show a bit of a change in their social behavior, as maybe they're trying to find a new partner, they're trying to strengthen a sort of connection that had previously been a bit secondary. But what we knew from our previous work with the faithful and the divorced birds is that some birds that have been breeding together are not investing in that relationship. So those divorced pairs, we assumed, were not going to care if their partner died, as sad as that sounds. So we were only interested in analysing the reactions of birds that were widowed when they were going to go on to be faithful, as opposed to seeing the reaction of birds where they had been going to go on to be divorced. So I won't get into the details of this next graph too much, but just to give you the basics of it, we wanted to build a model that could predict whether pairs were going to go on to be faithful or go on to be divorced, even if one of them died partway through the season. And what we found, this is just how accurate we were, basically, and this is how accurate we were whenever the partner happened to die. So at what point in the season the partner died. Purple line is how good are we at it if we just say that all the pairs are faithful. And about 80% of our pairs are faithful. So our accuracy stays at about 80%. And with our model, which is the orange line, about halfway through the season, we can get up to around 85%, 90% accuracy at predicting that a pair was going to go on to be faithful or divorced. So we're pretty happy with that. So the kind of pair types I'll be talking about as we go on through the talk. If I'm talking about a faithful widowed pair, that means a pair that one of the birds died, but this model had predicted that if that hadn't, they would have gone on to be faithful. So we think that there's a sort of investment in that relationship, that they're actually going to, at risk of anthropomorphizing too much, care if that bird dies, as opposed to the divorced birds, which might not. So how do the faithful widowed birds change their behavior immediately after widowing? So in the sort of first moments, the first few days after their partner dies, do we see any kind of change in their behavior? Now, to build up this graph a little bit again, here we have the weekend before widowing, here we have the weekend after, and this is what we call their daily degree. Degree is just a measure of how many other individuals they know. So if you have 5 friends, your degree is 5. These numbers are very low because we do this sort of normalizing process that I won't get into details about now. You can ask about it later if you like, but all you need to know is a higher value of degree means you just have more friends. Focus on the thick lines when this pops up. It can be quite a chaotic graph, but what we can see, wrong way. This orange line is the faithful widowed birds. So those are the birds that we think were invested in their relationship and then their partner died. And we can see that they are the only birds that increase their degree in that context. So they increase their number of friends after their partner dies, which is sort of interesting. We were kind of curious about why or how they were doing that. And we thought that maybe what was going on is that they were trying to increase their number of potential partners. So they might be going and trying to make a load of new friends to sort of, again, anthropomorphizing a bit, they're dating around, they're trying to find a replacement for their dead partner. So we thought we might see a signal of that if we looked at their number of opposite sex connections. So now we're looking at the proportion of opposite sex connections. If you're a male and that number is 1, that means you only hang out with females. If you're a female and if you're a male and that number is 0, it means you only hang out with males, and vice versa for females. But what we saw here was that actually there was no change in the proportion of opposite sex associates. So they didn't seem to be focusing their increase in degree on like making new friends of the opposite sex. They were just kind of increasing their number of associates. And unfortunately, I don't have a really exciting conclusion about why this is or what they're doing, because we actually don't know. So this is a bit of a kind of question mark for us about the sort of purpose of increasing your number of connections after a widowing event, if it's not in order to find a new partner. But we were also interested in what happens over the long term. So not just in that immediate moment after the widowing, but over the sort of whole of that winter season. In pretty much every single metric that we looked at. So every kind of social behavior that we could think of that might be affected, there was absolutely no change over the long term. So they seem to be pretty good at returning very quickly to normal and not really changing their behavior in any significant way. There was only one thing where we saw a change in the long term, and that was in this measure we're going to call average top opposite sex SRI, which is quite confusing. The SRI here stands for simple ratio index. I ran you through that earlier. That's how often you're seen associated with another individual. And this is the simple ratio index that that bird has with their closest friend of the opposite sex. So it's a bit confusing. We're sort of using their top opposite sex associate as a proxy for who they might be thinking might be their next partner. So it's sort of like who's top of the line to come in next. Yes.
Do they only make in the spring? The winter is like
yeah.
They're socializing.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat that so everyone can hear?
So the question was whether they only mate in the spring. And yes, so they have all their breeding behaviors in the spring. And the winter, they're just feeding, but they're also using it to kind of prep socially for what's going to be going on in the spring, looking for territory, looking for nest boxes, all those sorts of things.
So you making predictions based on their winter behavior?
So these behavioural measures are their winter behaviour, and we're interested in how their kind of spring behaviour, which is the categories here, is related to their winter behaviour. Yeah, so all these behaviours are happening in the winter, but we're kind of curious about how they relate to the spring, what's going on in the spring. Yeah, yeah. I know this was a problem I had when I was first writing about it, is trying to like make sure everyone was able to follow the timeline, because it gets a bit which spring, which winter. No, you're so fine. It's important to understand, so it's a good question. So yeah, we're looking at, okay, they have this closest friend of the opposite sex. How close are they with that closest friend? Hope that makes sense as a sort of thing that we're looking at. And what we see is just that those faithful widowed birds are kind of lower in that measure than birds that weren't widowed. It suggests that they're sort of less close with their partner in the long term if they've had to find a new one in the middle of the winter, which does make sense. And it is quite an important measure. It has a relation to your reproductive success. So if you're very close with your partner, you're more likely to have a more successful breeding spring. So it is actually important, and this is a potentially kind of detrimental thing that happens. But we actually also found some evidence that this difference kind of evens out over the winter, so that by the end of the winter, it's not actually nearly as significant as this makes it look, the kind of difference between those types of pairs. So it's a little bit up in the air still whether there might be any actual fitness consequences of this. So whether they're likely to show any negative impacts in their life based on this difference. So overall, kind of the conclusion is that great tits are very robust to the death of their breeding partner. So they seem pretty able to adjust their behavior where they need to and not really show that much of a response, which suggests that it's not a hugely important thing to happen to them. It's a bit of a surprise because it's a very important relationship. But on the other hand, if great tits are good at anything, it is dying. So it does make sense as a great tit that you do have to be prepared for the chance that any important relationship might end a bit earlier than you want it to be. But overall, what we see is that the great tits are definitely able to adjust their social behavior and show these kind of specific social responses or non-responses to things that are going on in their life, which suggests that they are pretty resilient to changes in their environment, and kind of reinforces what I was talking about at the start, where it's not just important to think about networks as unchanging, but really important to think about the individuals in them and what they are doing in response to what's going on around them. But yeah, thank you very much for coming along. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Daisy. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. Let's take a break now just for 3 or 4 minutes and come back soon. Okay, so having got my view of Daisy back a bit, So obviously, I'm so sorry before it's not turned around.
Really over here.
That's fine, don't worry. Absolutely fine. So how we're going to do this is I will look in the chat shortly for anybody making comments or questions online. People in the room. If you're in the room, give me time to get to you, and then you use the mic. These are proper modern mics, right? Do that. You got to point it at your mouth, like Lady Gaga. Okay, and obviously talk more clearly than I am because that would help. But give me time, I'll come round to you and we will alternate a bit. I have a few quiet questions, but I will wait and see who in the room would like to start. Sitting on the hands. Yeah. Keep mic up.
Thank you. I was wondering, do they need to witness that their partner dies to realize they're dead and look for another partner?
This is a very good question. Is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh, there I am. Okay. Yeah, it's a very good question. We don't really know. The thing is, when we say died in this particular context, what we mean in terms of our data is just they stopped turning up. And we assume that they died, but that's where the migrated bit comes in. They might have just left, or they might have decided they're sick of this feeder business and they're not going to do it anymore. Probably the most likely explanation is that they've died, but we don't know if the birds actually see that happen or if they just are like, haven't seen her in a while, I guess I'll start sorting something else out. When we're looking at the immediately after the widowing thing, we actually, I didn't go into too much detail of this because it gets a little bit confusing. We only looked at their social behaviour in weekends. So the feeders were only open on the weekend. And that was so that we didn't change their social behaviour too much by making them come to the feeders. So they kind of have the whole week to do their normal thing. And then we pop in, we measure it quickly, and then we get out so that we're not kind of creating this effect where we're changing their behaviour. So in the kind of immediately after widowing measure, there's this assumption that they've had a few days during the week to like catch up to what's going on. But it is a bit of a question. There's my actual paper for this, I've written it up, is 15 pages, and the supplementary information is 80, and most of that is dedicated to trying to prove that we can believe that they're dead just because they don't turn up. So it is a slightly touchy one, but I think so, hopefully.
Is it possible that some of that data is also them having lost their radio tag?
Yes, it is. So there's definitely going to be a couple of those in the data set. Sometimes they don't lose it, it just stops working. The good thing is that if we then catch them at any point later, we'll know that it stopped working or that they've lost it, and that can be back updated. But if it stops working and then for whatever reason we never catch them again, we'll never know. So there is definitely a bit of kind of margin of error in that about the things that aren't dying when other stuff has happened to them.
So I wanted to ask about that. Mm-hmm. Two things really. One is what's your general, how often do you catch them, how do you catch them, and what are you doing with that? But also, you said you were using data going right back to 1961. I can't believe they were using radio tags.
No.
So what were they doing instead?
So the feeder data is just 2011, 2015, and that's where the radio tags come in. So they've only been putting the radio tags on them since about 2010. The way that we catch them in the spring, I was just talking, I've been spotted in the woods by someone here. So someone's experienced this. Basically, we have the nest boxes up. It's all very silly. I'm dressed head to toe camo gear, crouched in the bush. You have to wait until the bird flies into the nest box, hoping they don't spot you. And they're really, really good at spotting you. So this is quite a stressful period. And then run as fast as you can, hand over the nest box hole, reach in, get the bird out. So it's not very high tech. They're sort of working on developing some like traps we can use, but they're quite clunky, and the best method is still just animal chase them. But basically, that's kind of, if they nest in the boxes, we catch them, and then we have an idea of who they are. We can put a ring on them if they don't really have one. We also ring and put radio tags on all of the chicks. So before they fledge, they get a ring and a radio tag on. So that means we cover a lot of the population There are some immigrants, and we do ringing during the winter to get those ones. So we will like put up nets during the winter, catch them, and that means we hopefully cover a lot of the immigrant birds. So they think we have about 90% of the population ringed, but it's a bit hard to tell. So that's our kind of best estimate. Yeah.
And how big is the population?
It is in a year of great tits. It's like few hundred, 500-ish. It varies a lot year to year, but it's in the kind of hundreds. Some really good years could be up to 1,000, but that's like about a year. So I'd say around 400 a year.
And my second question was about what do you think was happening in the 60s that allowed them to get this data?
Basically, someone at Oxford was just like, oh, that'd be cool. So it was kind of as there was a real turn in ecology to being interested in like individuals and in processes that were happening over kind of long periods of time. And so it was someone who just thought that would be a really interesting question. We'll just look at all the individuals as long as we can. And it's actually been a very useful thing. For example, one of the big findings that has come out of this data set is looking at the date that they lay their eggs and seeing how that has gone earlier and earlier with climate change. So those are the kind of things that you can only see if you're looking over these really long timescales, which is pretty cool.
By how much has that moved in total? Any idea?
Oh, this is like being quizzed by my supervisor, because this isn't exactly
Like your Viper, right?
Yeah. Oh, if I'm remembering correctly, it's somewhere around a week, maybe 2. It's quite significant.
That's counted as significant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it feels significant when every year we have to start work earlier. Yeah.
Just going to have anybody in the room want to thinking.
Yeah. First, I might have dismissed this, but like, you said that you like check them by hand. What's the point of the radio tag? Because at the beginning I thought you said that the box like recognizes them.
Yeah, so there's 2 kind of different processes. So we have the 2 data sets, the nest boxes and the feeders. So the nest boxes, we have to check them by hand. We do have sometimes loggers that we can put on the nest boxes to register the radio tags, but there's all sorts of logistical problems with that. That means it's still just easier to do it by hand. But the feeders are where we're not there. It's just the feeder has a little logger and the radio tags getting registered. So there's kind of 2 separate processes, which, yeah, is a bit confusing. Let's see if we can zip back really quickly. See if it's worth going back. There we are. So these little dots in the nest boxes, that's where they're breeding in during the spring, and that's where we'll go catch them and check them by hand. And the big dots are feeders, so kind of just like a bird feeder you'd have in your garden, except a bit bigger and also with radio tag log on it. And so that is where we are using the radio tags instead of catching them by hand. Yeah.
So how do you know that they're like interacting? Is it because they're there at the same time and it?
Yeah. So this is a thing in social networks with animals, is we have to define what an association is. And we use something that has a very cool name. It's called the gambit of the group. And that is this assumption that if you are in a group together, you are associating together. Now, we can really quickly from our own social lives see some of the limitations to this. For example, we are all here in a group together right now, but some of you are not actually going to associate together today. You might not interact, you might never see each other again. For some processes like disease spread, this doesn't actually matter that much, because just being in the group is enough to say you might have had some exposure. But with a thing like this, where you're looking at associations more specifically, there is this kind of question of how accurate is that assumption that if you're in the group together, you like know each other. A further assumption we make is that that sort of evens out over time, so that if you do that enough, you're going to generally get a pattern of social choice as opposed to just you are randomly in the same place together. But it's a really good question because it's quite an interesting field. But it's like, how do you define an association when you can't ask an animal like your friends? You just have to guess based on what they're doing.
Just want to jump in there because anyone who's got a feeder at home knows there are some combinations of birds don't stay on the feeder at all with each other.
Yeah.
Or they wait to one side until somebody's gone.
Yeah.
So is that the other thing that might be coming into this? You're kind of assuming if they tolerate being at the feeder at the same time, that means something.
Yeah, so there's the kind of simple ratio index measure that I use is quite broad. So we're saying they're in a flock together at the same time. And a flock, we use this kind of mathematical algorithm to pick up flocks from the stream of like birds coming in, which I didn't invent, and I just plug it into my computer and I go, yep, done that, and it pops something out of it, which is great. But that's quite broad. A flock can sort of go on for half an hour. So again, there's this quite big assumption that a bird at the start of the flock and a bird at the end of that flock, half an hour, know each other, which might not be true. But we're assuming over time, if you do it enough, that's gonna, those little bits where it's not true are gonna even out in the, come out in the wash, basically. But another analysis I did in this paper where we're looking at divorce that I didn't include in the presentation is looking at how often the pairs come to the feeder within 3 seconds of each other. So we've got this quite like quick little thing, and that is a slightly more fine scale question of, are they actually really at the feeder at the same time? And what we see actually, and this is quite interesting, I didn't have time to put it in, but I should have put the graph at the end so I could come back to it if anyone asked. It's a slightly different pattern actually. So in the simple ratio index, we see they start separate and they stay separate. In the question of how often are they coming to the feeder in really rapid succession, faithful and divorced birds start the same and they separate as the winter goes out. So what might be happening is 2 slightly different processes. At the beginning, it might be more kind of spatial and more about where they are. And then at the end of the winter, it might be a little bit more about who they're with, which is getting into kind of more complicated causal questions as well, that are all quite interesting. Yeah.
I was wondering if you know whether the time of widowing matters.
Yeah, so we have, actually, this is one graph I did put at the end from a conference that I went to where I thought someone might ask this. We can get to the end. So this is a sort of diagram of about when they die. It's pretty in the middle. There's a bit of a mix. I actually just realized this is not the graph I thought it was, so ignore that. So I didn't say that. That's fine, wrong graph, never mind. It's pretty normally distributed throughout the season, basically. So there's a few at the start, most in the middle, a few at the end. But we didn't have the sample size to look at how that affects things. So that would be really interesting. It's like you'd assume if they died earlier, it would matter less than if they died later, but we just didn't really have the sample to look at it, unfortunately, for each of the kind of times of death. So it's a big question mark, yeah.
Do you know if anyone's done anything similar to the study in other bird species, and how might things vary depending on how long, you know, sort of how gregarious they are?
There haven't been that many similar things because we're very lucky to have the data set we have. So you can't really do anything too similar without a quite huge data set like we've got, which is very lucky, very cool that we can do that. My suspicion would be that if they were longer lived, they would probably show more of a response to actually, what is my suspicion? In terms of divorce, birds, you do better the longer you know your partner. So the more years that you breed together, the higher reproductive success goes, basically, as you kind of adjust to your partnership and you figure out how it works for you. And so there's this kind of trade-off of like, do I want to get a divorce if I might be able to find someone new, but also that if I don't, I'll improve with that partner. And so I think that long-lived species are actually less likely to divorce because they're like, well, even if things are a bit dodgy now, if we stick it out, we'll get better, and that might be better in the long term. But even species that people think of as really like mating for life, they do get occasionally divorced. In terms of the widowing, what I would guess that would mean, I kind of haven't thought about this much, so I'm thinking about it on the spot, is that if you were less likely to get divorced, it would be more impactful to be widowed, because you would presumably have invested a little bit more in that relationship. And similarly, if you were less gregarious or if you're less social, you would maybe need to make a little bit more effort to find a replacement partner. Whether I think, my suspicion, and we haven't really figured out a way to prove this, but my suspicion is that the great tits just kind of have a lot of potential partners in their back pocket. And so it's not actually the end of the world if their partner dies. But if you're a bit less social, you might have a few less options. And so you might have to expend a bit more effort. So you might show more of a change after widowing. Would be my guess, but like I said, I haven't really thought about it, so this is off the dome. Yeah.
And on a related note, if a bird's been like genetically kind of promiscuous and then has a divorce, do you know, is it more likely to then form a new pairing with like a bird that it's bred with previously outside of it?
This question is like my white whale, because they did, the way that they figured out that they were genetically not monogamous is by doing some blood testing, and they did that in the early 2000s, and they only did it for like 2 years or something, and so there is just not actually that much data where we know if the birds had offspring in other nests, and if so, who they were with, and that kind of broader question. And so I really want to know, but I basically don't have the data to be able to address it. So it's like a real, because I think it's a really interesting question. And also whether the birds might be more likely, because they tend to divorce if their partner is lower quality, whether they would be more likely to breed with other birds if they think their partner is lower quality. They might be like, oh, I should sort of hedge my bets a bit. But yeah, I don't really have the data to answer that, unfortunately, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Daisy, this is slightly off your kind of behavioural level, but I wonder if you know the answer to this. You talked about the longer they stay with partners, the better, more successful birds are. Is that in terms of number of, offspring they have, or is it in terms of rearing them better? And does anyone know about that?
I think it's slightly a combination of both. So I'm trying to remember, this is a study that was done on the great tits where they looked at predictors of divorce. And it did, I think it was a combination of the number of chicks and then, the success of getting them to fledging. But I think the fledging tends to be whether they all died or whether some of them survived, because they're not very good at counting. So I think it's quite sort of general measures rather than, we got 5 to adulthood. So it's quite a general thing. But they definitely have some ability to tell if things didn't go so well versus when they did. The question in animal divorce, there's kind of 2 theories why animals might get divorced, one of which is the trading up hypothesis, which is that one of them is like, well, I can just get someone better, I'm going to leave you and go find a better partner. And then there's the mutual incompatibility hypothesis, which is that both of them are like, this didn't work out. It's impossible to talk about these things without anthropomorphizing like crazy, so you have to forgive me that. But yeah, if they sort of recognize that the breeding season didn't go too well, it's unclear whether that's then a kind of mutual decision or whether one of them's just like, no, I'm out of here. Yeah.
So difficult, isn't it, when you can't ask them? Got a question online. Have any genetic analysis studies been carried out with this population? If so, what are the key questions that have been asked?
Oh, this is not my field, and it's a bit I actively avoid because I find genetic stuff really hard. But they are doing a few things at the moment. One of the really interesting things is something my lab group is quite interested in is local adaptation. So when you study, so I'm going to have to zip all the way back through the presentation again. When you study populations and you're looking at adaptations of populations to their environment, often the way people do that is by looking at sort of populations as a whole. So you might look at, okay, the whiten population as a whole does X, Y, Z, especially when you're looking in the context of sort of this phenology stuff, which is what I was talking about with the timing of when they hatch their eggs. So phenology is kind of timing of biological events. So you say, okay, well, the whiting population as a whole is adapted to do this thing at this particular time. But something my lab group is interested in is the question of, well, actually, this area is going to be quite different from this area. And we can't necessarily say that the birds as a whole are adapted to a particular set of conditions when there might be these quite specific sort of micro conditions. And so they've been doing some genetic testing of the birds in the woods. So they're looking at dispersals. They're looking at where a bird was born, then where it moved to its adult, and where its parents were born. And by looking at that, trying to build up a picture of whether they're adapted to their specific area, and also whether they tend to move to areas that are more like the place they were born. So more like where they might be adapted to on that very, very fine scale. But yeah, I'm sort of the hold-on social behaviorist of my lab group. Everyone's moving on to other genetic things, which make me quite confused. So yeah, that's a bit out of my wheelhouse.
Did you say that there were different kinds of monogamy, like genetic monogamy and something else? Could you explain that?
Yeah, so there's genetic monogamy and social monogamy. We're talking about animals here. I won't extend this to people. But basically, social monogamy is where they are partners during the breeding season, and they are, sort of doing all the work of being partners together and in a pair. And then genetic monogamy is if they are only breeding within that pair. So great tits are socially monogamous. They raise their chicks as a pair, they defend their territory as a pair, they build their nests as a pair, but they're not genetically monogamous. So there's what we call extra pair copulation, which is where the males, the females are sort of based at the nest box, the males will travel and then they might breed with other females at the nest boxes. And so in a given nest, there will be occasionally some chicks that are not the chicks of the male that is taking care of that nest. But it's sort of, I think, evolutionarily evens out, because the males are going to be looking after maybe a few chicks that aren't theirs, but also there will be a few chicks in other nests that are theirs that they're not having to look after. So it all kind of evens out in the end in terms of investment. What that does mean is that for a female, every single bit of her reproduction in that breeding season is in this nest box. Whether for the male, he's a bit more like, well, if this all goes along, I've got a few backups. So what you see is that if the nest isn't going too well, the males will desert first. So you do get a few nests where the female was left to her own devices because the male has decided that isn't going well, it's not worth the investment, and he's like, well, I've got chicks in another nest, so I'll leave this one. Which all feels a bit callous, but yeah.
So can one female in, like, you know what you call it, like a litter of birds? I don't know, thinking of like cats, but can it be from multiple males, or is it just one?
One. So wait, I'll make sure I understand the question right. Within a nest, there'll be chicks with different fathers. So she will be fertilized, like each egg will be fertilized separately. So she'll like lay an egg from this father one day, an egg from another father the next. So within the nest, there'll be a little mix.
And will the same male look after only their babies?
Yeah, so there's at each nest box, only one pair is looking after it. So there's one male and one female, typically, looking after that particular nest box. And then they might, despite that, have chicks in other nests, but they won't be putting any parental care into those chicks.
So if there's one pair that are like socially monogamous, like you're saying, if the female has babies with different males and they're all in the same nest, will that male from that pair look after all those babies or only his babies?
Yeah, all those babies. So the females will lay all their eggs in their nest because they're sort of like tied to that nest. But the males will still look after all those eggs because they can't tell which chicks are theirs. So they have to sort of just look after all of them and hope that they've got it right, and hope that they are investing. And again, this is the thing where it sort of evens out. So they're going to invest in all those chicks, even though, you know, I'm saying they know, the individual probably doesn't know, but evolutionarily, it still makes sense to invest in all those chicks, because even if you're spending a little bit of investment on ones that aren't yours, there are a few in other nests that are yours. So it kind of doesn't matter if you're like doing a bit, yeah. Don't draw any conclusions about this to people. It's not related to us at all. This is just what these guys are up to.
So you dropped a teaser in there and to pick you up on it. You said that typically it's one male, one female. What else happens?
To be honest, we don't really know. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So one of which is that we only catch pairs at nest once they've laid eggs. So we wouldn't pick up on, for example, a pair of two males because they wouldn't have any eggs. So we would just think, oh, this nest hasn't worked out, never mind. We might pick up on a pair of two females, but what we do, again, this is kind of an example of something I find quite interesting, where we have this assumption that it's one male and one female, and by having that assumption, we kind of make it true, because we will catch at a nest, and once we've caught one male and one female, we stop. So there is a chance that we've missed situations where there might have been other birds around. We do occasionally catch, I think I've caught at one nest box in 3 years, another male where I was expecting to catch a female. But what we think, and this might not be true, what we think is that that is a case where another male is sort of like seeing what's going on, more than being actually invested in the parental care. It seems to be more likely that they're just sort of exploring the area, seeing other nest boxes, poking their head in, checking on the progress of their neighbours. But it's something that I think we aren't set up to study. So I think it would be quite interesting to put a bit more active into seeing if there are any different combos. Because in a lot of animals, there are all sorts of things going on. So you never know.
And of course, your swoop in and catch them one weekend doesn't work. It's not that you can't do that longitudinally, because they really get quite harassed by you.
Yeah, so we try and limit as much as possible our catching at the boxes. So, for example, sometimes we don't succeed in catching the adults at the boxes. We have a rule that if you try 3 times and you fail, you stop, because you don't want to bug them too much, because they will desert the nests if they feel too stressed. And you can only do it after the chicks are old enough as well. If you do it while they're too young, the birds haven't put enough energy into it yet, and they're more likely to just go, I don't like this, I'm out of here. But if the chicks are old, they're like, oh, I've already done all this. Even if there's these people hanging around, I better keep trying. But yeah, there's sort of a limit to what we're able to do in terms of tracking them.
And would they be scared of, if you went to a point where the eggs have been laid but haven't hatched yet? That would be scary as well.
So we'll like look at the nest boxes then, and the adults will see us doing that. But the kind of scariest thing for them is to actually court. And so we can get away with, when the eggs have been laid, kind of taking the lid off the nest box and having a little poke around and going away. But I think if you caught a bird at that point, it wouldn't definitely desert, but you would be really risking it. Yeah, and we don't want to mess with them in that way too much.
So you kind of mentioned that the females stay in the nest box through the winter. Do you see if they return to the same one the next gen, or is that not something you look for?
Yeah, there's a bit of a mix. So they tend to stay quite in the same area, but they move around the nest boxes a little bit. Our suspicion is that there are some nest boxes that are preferable, and there's enough turnover that every year there'll be a bit of a shuffle where they sort of are squabbling over who gets the best nest boxes. But they definitely stay in the same area, and even if they've had a divorce, they still don't tend to go too far. So actually, in that model where we were trying to predict which birds were faithful, which were divorced, we plugged in how far their next nest box was the next year from the one, and it didn't come out as a predictor at all. So it doesn't seem to do a good job at telling you whether they're faithful or divorced, how far they move, which means vice versa, how far they move doesn't really have much to do with getting a divorce.
Yes, I mean, obvious question is, do you ever use cameras to do your investigations?
Not for my particular work, but some other people in my lab group have. So, for example, someone is looking at where the birds forage, so where they go when they have chicks, and how sort of effective their foraging is. So they have a little camera on the nest box, and when the bird comes in, it's able to use AI to detect what it's carrying, and so to get a sense of what they're giving the chicks and how good the food is. Some things are much more preferable than others. For example, a little great tit chick loves a caterpillar, but will like choke down a spider. So you can get a sense of how nutritious the food is, how much they're bringing in, and that's something that they've done with the cameras, which is pretty cool.
Right.
Feels like extended version of Spring Watch, mixed somehow with the traitors in my head. And your friend's amazing cartoons. I was going to ask, do you see anything in this kind of work which could tell stories that might be relevant to other parts of the animal kingdom?
Yeah, I think like obviously my work is quite specifically on this population, but my question is quite broad about the kind of social behavior more generally, and particularly, yeah, that question of thinking of individual animals as very much in control of their social environment. I think that's a real kind of shift in the way that we think about animal social lives. And we definitely give ourselves that credit, right? Like when we think about our own social life, we think of ourselves as very much actively creating that and actively creating the social life that we want to have and associating with the people that we like and avoiding the people that we don't. And I think there hasn't, even if we understand that animals might do that, that hasn't necessarily been the way in which we treat that data or the way in which we analyze it in that very kind of agent-based way. And so I think that's thinking about it in that way is really important because it helps us understand what's going on better and understand what they're up out there. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, would it be possible to use like GPS tags instead of like interrupting them so that you can just see like where they are and then use probability to or whatever, or like distance?
Again, that's my dream. The problem is literally just one weight. So we can't weigh down the birds too much. There was actually this was before my time, but when they were first deciding to put the radio tags on them, they figured out the percent of a great tit's weight that they are and all walked around for the day with that tied on their leg to sort of see, like, they were like, if we're going to do this to the birds, we have to actually understand what we're doing to them. And even that, it's pretty light, but it's not nothing. You know, walking around with a kg on your leg is like not the most fun in the world. And so it's really important to think about the actual effect we might be having on the birds through that as well. We think it's negligible. So we think that it's not enough weight, but any more accurate tags are going to weigh more and more and more. So the person in my lab, the DPhil student who was doing the work with the cameras and looking at the feeding, that's part of a project she's doing, which she's testing out alternative ways to track them. So she's got these, you basically put a little backpack on the bird, and then they have these like kind of signal towers, but imagine small little signal pole in the woods, and you can kind of triangulate where the bird is. And by using that kind of triangulation, you don't need quite as much meat in the tag as if you're doing like a satellite GPS thing. But it's all quite complicated and you have to be really careful to keep it light. And that is, even with all the best technology we have, quite hard and very expensive. So at the moment, this is kind of the best we've got, unfortunately, because it would be really cool to have more fine-grained stuff. But yeah, it's the best we can do.
I am going to go back and look. The advantage of having done this for years is we have a lot of speakers. And I think it was somebody from the National Bee Trust who was telling us how they have hair-thin transmitters on bees to look at movement between hives, between flower meadows and things like that. It's very accurate, if I remember right. There is some really amazing stuff out there.
Yeah.
And they were doing these onto the back of the head of the bee.
The main problem for us is honestly just money, because if we want to do it on a population level with a few hundred birds, it adds up really, really quick. And I think a lot of the processes that we're interested in are happening at population levels. But these things only get cheaper as time goes on. So you never know, in like 5 years, it might be £1 a transmitter and then we can chuck them on all the birds. It'd be great, hopefully.
Very, very good. I am going to wind up unless there's any urgent questions. Please stop and chat. while I'm clearing up in a minute. And also, Daisy might manage to get that video working. I think the mistake is we need to have the video in the same folder.
Okay.
This is a PowerPoint problem, not anything else.
Okay, we'll try.
But just to kind of wind up now, because I've got to put a bit more than usual back in the room due to it being Christmas lunch tomorrow. If you know anyone in pharmacology, then you can get yourself invited, I'm sure. Anyway, thank you very, very much. As usual, I would give my thanks to Pharmacology, who let us have space for free, which is very, very kind of them. So there are Santa Clauses. To the people in the room who've come, to the people online who've joined in as well. And to say that there is a backlog. I need to do some video editing and uploading. There will be backlog videos, I think roughly the last 6 months or so, of the cafes. If you want to have a look at them, join the mailing list if you haven't already, and that way you'll hear when I put them up. We have a public Oxford Café Sci YouTube channel, and on that you can see a handful of them where speakers have said they're happy for those to go out in public in full. People are a bit more careful about their images nowadays. So I'll ask Daisy in a minute what she thinks about hers, but we have a few more to add to that one. And if you're on the mailing list, you can go and look at the private ones. I keep those on subscriber only, not subscriber, on private channels where you can only get it if you get the link. And the link is only through the mailing list. We ask people to give that only to people who are friendly. There are some speakers who don't really want to be got at by people making lots of comments. But anyway, there's quite a trove of those. We went online in April 2020. We'd just done our March Cafe when the lockdown happened. So we went online straight after that. And we have been online as well as in person ever since. But it is lovely to see you guys in the room. Do take some of the fresh food home with you, and any of the crisps, and the Christmas chocolate coins are there, especially for you guys. You're lovely for turning up. Just also to say that the cafe does survive on donations. The drinks, the snacks, any expenses. Thankfully, Daisy very kindly is giving her time for free, as all our local speakers do, and don't have to pay her travel expenses. So I suspect it's not very far. Are you down Museum Road? Not lucky enough.
I'm a
15-minute walk. Okay. And yeah, so but we do have expenses, and I'm still paying myself back for some of this equipment, microphones and speakers and screen and all that kind of stuff. So if you would like to contribute tonight by cash, you need to put cash in the black hat. If you would like to give online, the website has how to donate online through PayPal, which will take any normal credit or debit card. And it really, really appreciate those who donated. There's some very generous people out there. It makes a huge difference to be able to keep on running this. So the website has people coming up. January, there's a gap in February at the moment. January is basically how wind turbines really work, i.e. the real life, how they work out, pros, cons, issues, all sorts of stuff from a guy in the engineering department here. And then in March, we've got the Thirsty Earth about water use, water saving, water problems around the world, from again somebody from Oxford. I will fill February as quickly as I can. So look on the website for the upcoming ones. I hope to see you again in January, whatever the weather. It's lovely and snug and warm in here. Okay, so please come. And if anybody who lives in Oxford and normally drives is thinking of not coming, please occasionally spend one of your car vouchers to come into the centre. Or just come back the road, because then you don't have to have them. So that'd be great. My biggest thanks, of course, to Daisy for a brilliant presentation today. Thank you very, very much indeed. Right.